So what did the what recommendations did the Chesapeake Bay Foundation contribute to the ASMFC recommendations, or the things that they're coming up with, the ASFMC is coming up with?
At this point, CBF has focused its efforts on basically 4 areas related to the public information document. First of all, one of the questions in the public information document is how long a period of time do we want to see these new management measures phased in? And basically we have options from 1 year out to 10 years. And at this point, CBF believes that a 3-year time frame is most appropriate for phasing in that new management plan. 1 year would admittedly probably be a little quick for the industry, but we've been working on this fishery for a very long time now. The fishery is at a state that we are currently, at least based on the last stock assessment, overfishing. So we think a 3-year time frame is very reasonable for moving forward with this new management plan. The second thing that we wanted to put forth in this is that we get accurate and timely reporting of all the catches of menhaden that are out there. Right now we have pretty good data on the bait fishery, the large bait fishery. We have, I think, what's considered probably pretty good data on the reduction fishery that operates in Chesapeake Bay and out in the ocean waters. We have very poor data on a lot of the other smaller bait fisheries that are out there. The pound nets that we see in Chesapeake Bay, the gill net fisheries that are fairly common in this area and that operate along the Atlantic coast. Unfortunately, those are very data poor type fisheries, and we need to get some additional information on those to accurately measure those and moving forward.
Let me ask you a question. So a reduction fishery is like a company who lands the catch to reduce the fish down to oil and components. So you're saying you have pretty good information on big companies that do reduction fishery.
Yeah, there's only one reduction fishery left on the East Coast. It's Omega Protein. They are based out of Houston, Texas, but they have one plant in Reedville, Virginia.
Which is on the
northern neck. On the northern
pretty
neck,
close.
Virginia. Yeah, fairly close by. And what they do is they catch their fish to reduce them down into oil and fish meal, basically. And they will refine that oil into several different grades of oil, from the very high-end human type uses that we see in omega-3 fish oil capsules and things like that, to a number of different agricultural uses, and also in some cases even pet food. So they sell the oils for various uses like that, and then they sell the fish meal, believe it or not, all around the world as a protein source for animal feeds, for aquaculture feeds, for a variety of uses that needs a protein source as part of some formula, usually for some sort of diet is what it ends up being used for. Historically, menhaden products in the reduction industry have been used for makeups, for paints, for all different types of uses. So there's been a wide variety of even industrial uses for menhaden oil in the past.
Which I'm sure there's probably some alternatives. And then the other one is a bait fishery.
Yeah, the bait fishery, that when people talk about the bait fishery, they tend to talk about what we refer to in Virginia as snapper rigs. And snapper rigs are menhaden harvesting vessels that are very similar in the gear type that they use. They use what we call purse seines, and purse seines are nets that float at the water surface, but they have basically a cord at the bottom of them. And the nets can be anywhere from 20 feet to sometimes 40 or 60 feet deep. And what they do is they actually purse the net, that cord at the bottom, up, and that's how the fish are pulled in together, and then they vacuum them from that net into the fishing boat. The snapper rigs are basically smaller versions of the reduction fishery vessels. The reduction fishery vessels tend to be somewhere on the order of 125 to 175 feet long, very large vessels, and in most cases they are actually vessels that have been reconditioned from Navy purposes and are now being used for the reduction fishery. They also have a couple of vessels now that used to be what we call offshore support vessels for the oil and gas industry down in the Gulf of Mexico. They've been now converted into that type of use, and they're used by the reduction industry. The boats in the snapper rig fishery, the bait fishery, tend to be, like I say, very similar in the way they operate and the gear they use, but they tend to be somewhere on the order of about 65 or 75 feet up to about 100 feet long, so slightly smaller in nature. And at times, actually, depending upon the market for bait and things like that, those vessels will actually sell back to Omega Protein as well if Omega Protein needs some additional fish, or the snapper rigs have excess fish that they need to get rid of. And then there's kind of this third component of the bait fishery, which is much smaller, that we don't have very good data on, and that's the pound nets and gill nets and things like that that we see operate throughout the coastal areas all along the Atlantic coast. In some cases, those operations are there to catch menhaden and sell them as bait to commercial watermen like crabbers and lobstermen and things like that. In other cases, they're set up primarily to sell to recreational fishermen who fish for rockfish and cobia, red drum, things like that with menhaden. In some cases, it's folks who will go out and gill net menhaden just to sell or use personally for their crab pots and things like that. So there's a wide range of uses in that kind of second tier of that bait fishery. And then the last component of the fishery is what we call the recreational fishery. And this tends to be recreational fishermen who are out fishing for rockfish or cobia or other things, and they'll actually go out and throw a pound net, or in some cases they'll use a very small gill net to catch menhaden to go use as bait, sometimes the same day, sometimes they'll catch it and freeze it or put it on ice and use it a couple days later. That segment of the fishery is extremely small, especially when you compare it to the reduction fishery and that large-scale bait fishery. And in that case, that's another issue that ASMFC, through their public information process right now, is trying to get information on. And CBF and I think a whole host of conservation organizations believe that fishery should be considered what we consider de minimis. And that basically means it's so small in comparison to other segments of the fishery that regulating it at this time is really not necessary.
So good information on reduction fishery and bait fishery, a couple of other segments that you don't have good information. But the thinking is that most of the tonnage and most of the catch is from the reduction fishery and the bait fisheries.
By far. In terms of the overall landings of menhaden, about 80% of the landings each year is by the reduction fishery alone. And that fishery lands only in one port up in Reedville, Virginia, and their landings are actually so large that Reedville, a little small town up there in the Northern Neck, ends up being somewhere between about the third and the sixth largest seafood landing town in all the United States each year because of the tonnage of menhaden that they actually land there. And like I say, their catch varies on average as a portion of the total, anywhere between about 75 and 85% of the total. And then the bait fishery, the large-scale bait fishery, the snapper rigs, they tend to catch another 15 to 20% of the total landings each year. And then everything else, the last 5% or so, tends to be those varied, much smaller bait fisheries that operate on a very local scale.